Lesson 127, the iota subscript. Catherine, in a lot of Greek textbooks, they just show you the different forms of nouns, and you have to just sort of memorize them. And I think that's a valid thing. You do need to commit things to memory.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I prefer to know why things are the way they are.
Absolutely. I'm the same way.
So instead of just throwing the iota subscript at our readers and listeners, I thought I would take a moment here and write a lesson on what the iota subscript is and how it got to be there in the first place, so that when they see the iota subscript, they know what exactly is going on and what it represents.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we talk about the iota subscript, we have to talk about methods of writing ancient Greek.
Which is its own fascinating history in and of itself.
Right. So let's give them a couple of really, big, important pieces of information about how Greek was written. Starting out, the ancient Greeks only had uppercase letters because they borrowed those letters from Semitic peoples. The alphabet as we know it originated, and really we covered this some in the very first lesson of the book, didn't we?
Right, with the importation of the alphabet from the Phoenicians and the adaptation that went on. And
exactly. Scholars don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but they do have a lot of it. And so certain characters from ancient Egypt were borrowed by Semitic peoples. And when I say Semitic peoples, that means peoples like the ancient Israelites and other related peoples like the Phoenicians. They were also Semitic. And so Semitic peoples who spoke a Semitic language took a few characters from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they borrowed them and they used them to represent sounds in their Semitic language. And over time, that developed and grew. Eventually, you get the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenicians were sea traders. They would sail all over the Mediterranean and trade goods.
Mm-hmm.
Scholars speculate that maybe they needed a writing system to help with record keeping. But anyway, the Phoenicians developed and popularized this Semitic alphabet. And then the Greeks, who were living in various places around the Mediterranean, they said, hey, you have a cool alphabet. We'd like to use that too. So they took the Semitic letters and used them to write down the Greek language. But the sounds in Greek weren't the same as the sounds in the Semitic language, so they had to adjust a few of the letters and change the sound of a couple of letters. So they adapted it into Greek. And so that original Greek alphabet, by the way, there was some variety of Greek alphabets from place to place. But generally speaking, the original Greek alphabet was uppercase only. It was just uppercase letters. There was no such thing as the way we write Greek today with this sort of cursive-looking lowercase style of writing, as you see here in this book. That totally did not exist.
Right. That had to be invented later in the medieval period because of the need for a system that was easier to write, because you had mostly medieval monks and scribes copying out long books by hand because there's no printing press yet. And so they needed something that would be easier to write than writing everything in capital letters. And our readers can actually see this for themselves by just trying to write a long sentence or a paragraph in all capital letters and then writing it in lowercase in the normal way that we would write with lowercase and uppercase, particularly if they're writing in cursive with that lowercase and uppercase. And they'll see just how many more strokes you have to make when it's all capital letters and how much harder it is on your hand than if you're writing in a much more flowy uppercase and lowercase.
And Catherine, I learned something recently. I was at the Library of Congress recently for a seminar about medieval texts. And there was this lady there who was an expert in ancient manuscripts. and she worked at the Library of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked her, I said, why is it that there was this switch from uppercase writing in Greek to lowercase writing? And she told me some things I didn't know. First of all, uppercase writing is generally associated with papyrus. You know, in ancient Egypt, along the banks of the Nile, would grow the papyrus plant. And so they would cut it into strips and lay the strips crossways, like one layer going one way and then another layer going the opposite way. And then they'd put a big rock on top of it and let it dry. And all the sticky juices would blend together and dry. And then when you take the top rock off, you have basically a piece of paper, papyrus paper. But papyrus paper is kind of grainy. And so it doesn't lend itself well to writing small letters. If you try to write small letters on something with lots of little bumpy lines in it, your pen will get caught on it. So papyrus lends itself to writing big letters with large strokes. So that's one issue. Another issue is that papyrus does a lot better in drier climates.
Yeah.
In climates that are wetter, like in Europe, the kinds of writing materials that lasted longer were animal skins.
Mm-hmm. Parchment and such.
Parchment, vellum. And so some of the oldest books at the Vatican, in the Vatican Library, are not papyrus, but, you know, made of animal skins, made of parchment and vellum.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a geographical issue and you have a humidity issue because humidity rots things. So a papyrus in a humid place, it's not going to last as long because the humidity will affect it. But in the dry climate of Egypt, a papyrus can last thousands of years. In fact, they can go out in the desert and discover things preserved perfectly from thousands of years ago simply because the climate is so dry.
Yeah.
So the papyrus lends itself to larger writing because it's bumpy, but parchment is extremely smooth. So you can write on it with very small letters. And so that's why ancient manuscripts with large writing tend to be papyri, and ancient manuscripts with lowercase writing, called minuscule, tend to be on parchment.
Wow. Cool.
So minuscule, generally speaking, minuscule is written on parchment. Uppercase, or majuscule, is written on papyri. And so the climate and the writing materials have to do with the writing style. It's all connected.
Makes sense.
So that's what this lady at the Library of Congress was explaining to me. And I think I knew a little bit, but I had never put it together quite in that way.
Yeah, me neither.
So this is part of the story of why, as you go into the medieval period, they start writing with minuscule. So, Catherine, this pertains to what we're saying here about the iota subscript, because as we go through this switch from writing in uppercase letters to writing in lowercase letters, they started to adjust the way that they write certain things, certain letter combinations.
Right. And the change in going from majuscule, i.e. all capital letters, to minuscule with lowercase letters affects how letters and diphthongs and sounds get represented. Because way, way, way back when, Greek had what in the book are called long diphthongs, i.e. a long vowel with an iota paired together, creating a diphthong, but not one of the diphthongs that we have already covered in our conversations and that are in the book that our listeners have already learned. These are things like omega plus iota and eta plus iota, which are not diphthongs that our listeners have learned because, well, they're not considered diphthongs in Greek anymore.
And sometimes in Greek textbooks, you'll see those diphthongs referred to as improper diphthongs. They have a little label for them.
And so those diphthongs, those long diphthongs or improper diphthongs, by the time that lowercase is being invented and used much more, those are no longer pronounced, but they still are part of the spelling of a word. So to represent the fact that they're no longer pronounced, but they're still part of the spelling, the iota in that long diphthong got moved from next to the letter down to underneath the long vowel. So for example, if you have omega and iota with one of these long or improper diphthongs, what happened was in uppercase, the omega and the iota are right next to each other. But in lowercase, the iota moves to underneath the omega, and it becomes this little extra, almost tail that's underneath the long vowel. So omega now has this, what's called an iota subscript, because it's written underneath. Sub in Latin means under. Script in Latin means written. So it's written underneath. That iota now has become an iota subscript underneath that long other vowel that it used to make an improper diphthong with.
So for an alpha, it seems like it's parked right under the middle of the letter. And with an omega, it's parked under the middle too. But with an eta, it's kind of on the left side, like under that left stroke.
Right.
And it goes down to about the same length as the downward stroke on the right.
Yes. And alpha ends up being with an iota subscript because those were long alphas instead of the alpha iota diphthong that has remained, which was a short alpha plus iota. So that one remained, but the long alpha plus iota became alpha with an iota subscript.
That's an excellent point, Catherine, because eta and omega, two out of these three vowels that can accept an iota subscript, those are long by nature. They're just always long. But the alpha is not. That could be long or short.
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of alpha, as you just said a moment ago, the kind of alpha that forms an improper diphthong is the long kind. So this is long alpha plus iota, not short alpha plus iota. That's a great point.
And that means that if our listeners ever see an alpha with an iota subscript underneath it, that means that that alpha is long.
It has to be long. Because if it's short alpha plus iota, that's just your regular garden variety alpha iota diphthong that you see
and
every day.
And that one does get pronounced.
Right. So that's a whole different thing. This is long alpha plus iota forming a long diphthong, or what they call improper diphthong.
And those are not pronounced. So it's just ah.
Now, I've spoken with a few teachers, Catherine, about this topic, and there are some teachers of Greek out there who actually do like to pronounce the iota subscript because it mimics the way Greek might have sounded in the classical period before they stopped pronouncing the iota subscript. So this could vary from teacher to teacher. In this particular book, I've arranged things in such a way where we don't pronounce the iota subscript.
Yeah. And I used to pronounce iota subscripts, but it became confusing for students with, are we doing a long alpha with an iota subscript? Are we doing an alpha iota diphthong? And so it just was easier not to.
And especially in this book, it would be especially confusing because they would confuse the dative singular and the nominative plural.
Right. And that's what happened.
Exactly. So in this book, I'm not pronouncing iota subscripts simply to make it easier for the students.
Mm-hmm.
And really, if they want to do that in the future, that's fine. They can do that. You know, if they want to study...
It's a very easy switch.
Yeah, if they want to study historical linguistics and go really deep into pronunciation, that's fine, and they can do that. But at this beginning stage, there's really no reason to do that. So in this book, we will not pronounce the iota subscript that you will see. In this book, you'll only see it under one letter. You'll just see it only under the letter omega, and we will not pronounce it. So just for fun, you know, Catherine, I'm kind of a geek, and I like to go digging around in old books.
I understand.
So, you understand all too well, right?
Oh, yes, definitely.
So as part of putting this book together, I wanted to go back in time to ancient Athens and find actual words that were written out with the iota subscript, what today would be an iota subscript. I wanted to find words that were written in all capital letters with the iota written on the same line. This is hundreds of years before they switched to writing Greek with lowercase or minuscule. And so the words that we see here, these all capital letters and then the lowercase versions, this is actually taken from a stone inscription from ancient Athens.
Nice.
And so what we're going to see is the way this word originally would have been written by a true, ancient Athenian somewhere around the year, 400 BC probably. And then the way that same word would be written today in minuscule in a modern printed text. So, Catherine, just for fun, we have the original way the word would have been written in ancient Athens with the iota on the same line. And then we have the way it would be written starting in the medieval period after they stopped pronouncing the iota, and they would just tuck it under the letter as a subscript.
Mm-hmm.
So our first word is charii. Based on what I've read, in ancient Athens, they would have pronounced the final iota, but then later they stopped pronouncing that. That alpha there, 2 letters from the end, is a long alpha. So the alpha and iota at the very end form what's called a long diphthong or an improper diphthong. Later on, after they stopped pronouncing the iota there in the improper diphthong in the medieval period, they turned that into an iota subscript, and it just gets tucked under the alpha. Just a mere remnant of the true iota that was there in the glory days of ancient Greece.
And then now we would pronounce it charia.
Right, we would not pronounce the iota, whereas, again, based on what I've read in ancient Athens, they would have pronounced it.
And then similarly, the inscription has philotadei with the iota adscript, the iota right next to it. But now we have philotade with just an iota subscript underneath the eta.
And with the first word, charii, we had to mention that the alpha, 2 letters from the end, is long. But here, there's no reason to mention that the eta, 2 letters from the end, is long, because eta is always long.
So there's no question.
So immediately, the eta and iota at the end of that word, in uppercase, it immediately jumps out at you as a long diphthong or improper diphthong. And so in minuscule, that iota gets subscripted. And as you can see, I've got 3 words total here with an example of each kind, the alpha iota, eta iota, and omega iota. There's one of each. So the final one is elbioi. Again, at the end of the word, you've got this improper diphthong, the long vowel omega plus an iota. So on the left, the way it was inscribed in stone, originally the iota was written on the same line. Then hundreds of years later, they stopped pronouncing the iota in that situation, and medieval scribes just write it as a subscript under the omega.
And then that becomes elbio.
Exactly. Many teachers today will not even pronounce the iota there, but some will, just out of a desire to have sort of a historical pronunciation. So just for fun, in this lesson, we wanted to give you an introduction to what the iota subscript is, how it got there, why it's there, what it's doing there, why it's parked under another letter. And so the reason for all this is that one of the endings you're going to see in the nouns that we are working with, one of those endings will contain an iota subscript. And so when you see that, we want you to recognize it and know what it is, instead of merely telling you to just memorize, hey, there's a mark there, memorize it. We wanted to give you a little bit of background so that you know what it is and why it's there, and hopefully that will enrich your learning and enrich your experience as you work with that particular ending.